I never thought I'd have to defend my inheritance at 26, but there I was, sitting across from my brother in the bank manager's office as he demanded I hand over my trust fund for the sake of family. If Mrs. Reynolds hadn't intervened that day, I might have surrendered my financial future to emotional manipulation. This is how I learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The notification arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. I was hunched over my desk in the cramped startup office, where I'd been working 60-hour weeks since graduating college, my eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets. The email subject line stood out amid the usual clutter of marketing newsletters and client updates. Urgent, regarding the estate of Eleanor Winters. My grandmother Eleanor had passed away 3 months prior. The grief still felt raw. She had been my anchor through a turbulent childhood, the one person who truly believed in me when my own parents seemed perpetually disappointed. At her funeral, family matters had been discussed briefly, with my uncle mentioning that her modest estate would be settled in due time. I hadn't given it much thought since then, focused instead on keeping my head above water at my demanding job while processing my loss. The email was from Patricia Reynolds, Senior Trust Manager at Meridian Financial Services. It requested my presence at their downtown office at my earliest convenience to discuss matters of significant financial importance. A phone number was provided should I have any questions. Curious but skeptical, I called the number during my lunch break, half expecting it to be some elaborate phishing attempt. Mrs. Reynolds answered personally, her voice warm but professional, as she confirmed the email's legitimacy. Your grandmother Eleanor established a trust fund in your name 20 years ago, she explained. Given recent events and your age requirements having been met, the assets are now available for distribution. A trust fund? I repeated, stunned. I had no idea. Eleanor was quite specific about keeping this arrangement private until the appropriate time, Mrs. Reynolds replied. Could you come in tomorrow at 2 p.m.? There are several documents that require your signature. I rearranged my work schedule, telling my boss I needed a personal afternoon. He wasn't pleased. We were approaching a critical deadline for our biggest client, but I rarely requested time off, so he reluctantly agreed. The following day, I arrived at Meridian Financial's impressive glass and steel building 15 minutes early. My stomach knotted with nervous anticipation. The receptionist directed me to the 11th floor, where Mrs. Reynolds was waiting. Patricia Reynolds defied my mental image of a bank manager. In her early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, she possessed a warmth that immediately put me at ease. Her office was understated but elegant, with framed photographs of what I assumed were her children and grandchildren arranged on the credenza behind her substantial desk. Charlotte? She smiled, extending her, and thank you for coming, please have a seat. I settled into the leather chair across from her, smoothing down my nicest blouse, purchased on sale 2 years ago, and wishing I'd had time to change out of my worn work slacks. Before we begin, Mrs. Reynolds said, I want to say that I knew your grandmother quite well. We worked together for over 15 years managing her assets. Eleanor was an exceptional woman, prudent, forward-thinking, and deeply committed to your future. The unexpected personal connection brought tears to my eyes. Thank you, I managed. She was everything to me. Mrs. Reynolds nodded sympathetically, before opening a substantial folder on her desk. As I mentioned on the phone, Eleanor established a trust fund in your name shortly after your 6th birthday. She contributed to it consistently over the years, and the investments have performed quite admirably. She slid a document across the desk, and I nearly gasped aloud at the figure printed at the bottom. $1,834,000. This must be a mistake, I stammered. It's accurate, Mrs. Reynolds assured me. Your grandmother was an astute investor and she had a significant inheritance of her own that she managed wisely. She was also insured for a substantial amount. My mind reeled, struggling to process the information. My grandmother had lived modestly in the same 3-bedroom house for 40 years. She drove a 10-year-old sedan. Her indulgences were limited to her garden and occasionally treating me to dinner when I visited. The idea that she had accumulated nearly $2 million seemed impossible. Eleanor was quite specific about the terms, Mrs. Reynolds continued, seemingly understanding my need for time to absorb the shock. The trust becomes available to you at age 26, which you turned last month, or upon completion of your graduate degree, whichever came first. There are no stipulations on how you use the funds, though she did include a letter with some suggestions. She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's distinctive flowing script. I clutched it tightly, not trusting myself to open it just yet. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor was concerned that knowing about such a substantial inheritance might affect your drive or your choices. She wanted you to find your path based on passion and purpose, not financial convenience. Mrs. Reynolds smiled gently. She spoke of you often and with great pride. Your achievements were entirely your own, and that mattered deeply to her. The tears I'd been holding back spilled over. My grandmother had watched me struggle through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, had listened to my worries about student loans and career choices, all while knowing this safety net existed. Not once had she hinted at it, even when I'd been at my most desperate. She was protecting me, I realized aloud, from both myself and others. Mrs. Reynolds nodded. Eleanor believed that wealth carries responsibility, and she wanted you to develop character and resilience before shouldering that burden. We spent the next hour reviewing documents and discussing options. The trust had been structured with remarkable foresight, with provisions for tax efficiency and continued growth. Mrs. Reynolds explained each element patiently, answering my overwhelmed questions with clarity and compassion. By the end of our meeting, I had signed the necessary paperwork to take control of the trust, though Mrs. Reynolds encouraged me not to make any major decisions immediately. "Give yourself time to adjust to this new reality," she advised. "The funds aren't going anywhere. Continue living as you have been for at least a few months while you consider your priorities." I agreed, grateful for her guidance. We scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following month to discuss investment strategies and potential financial planning. As I left the building, the late afternoon sunlight seemed unnaturally bright. The world looked identical to the one I'd navigated that morning, yet everything had fundamentally changed. I was no longer Charlotte Winters, overworked junior analyst living paycheck to paycheck in a shared apartment. I was Charlotte Winters, millionaire. That evening, alone in my room, I finally opened my grandmother's letter. Her familiar handwriting brought fresh tears. "My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, I've moved on, and you've reached the age where I believe you're ready for the responsibility that comes with financial independence. This trust represents not just my love for you, but my absolute faith in your judgment and character. You've faced challenges that would have broken lesser spirits, yet you've persevered with grace and determination. I've watched you work tirelessly toward your goals without expectation of assistance or advantage. That strength of character is worth more than any inheritance I could provide. This money is a tool, Charlotte, not a solution. Use it wisely to build the life you desire, but remember that true wealth lies in purpose, connection, and the knowledge that you've made a positive difference in the world. I have only one request. Keep this blessing private until you've determined how it fits into your life's plan. Money changes how people see you and sometimes how they treat you. Give yourself time to adjust before navigating those complexities. With all my love and confidence in you, Grandma Eleanor, I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling simultaneously bereft and profoundly connected to her. In death, as in life, she was looking out for me, offering not just financial security, but the wisdom to handle it appropriately. Little did I know how prophetic her warning about money-changing people would prove to be, or how soon I would face the test of protecting not just the inheritance itself, but the values and independence it was meant to foster. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For the first month after learning about my inheritance, I followed Mrs. Reynolds's advice, to the letter. I continued living exactly as before, working the same grueling hours at Visionary Analytics, sharing the cramped two-bedroom apartment with my roommate Zoe, and carefully budgeting each paycheck. The only tangible change was the new bank account I'd opened, where a portion of the trust had been transferred, its balance so substantial that I avoided looking at the banking app on my phone, the numbers seeming almost fictional. During our follow-up meeting, Mrs. Reynolds helped me establish a comprehensive financial plan. We allocated portions of the inheritance to different purposes: a conservative investment portfolio for long-term growth, an emergency fund, and a modest amount for immediate quality-of-life improvements. "You don't need to deprive yourself unnecessarily," she advised when I expressed guilt about potentially upgrading my living situation. "Eleanor wanted this money to enrich your life, not sit untouched while you continue to struggle." This permission, to actually use what my grandmother had so generously provided, was surprisingly difficult to accept. Growing up in a household where financial anxiety was a constant undercurrent, where my parents' poor decisions had created cycles of instability, I'd developed a complicated relationship with money. Financial security wasn't just about comfort. For me, it represented control, independence, and the freedom to make choices based on something other than desperation. Eventually, I allowed myself one significant change. I gave notice at my apartment and began searching for a place of my own. After weeks of viewings, I found a modest but charming one-bedroom condo in a historic building downtown. The price was reasonable given the location and character of the space, with large windows that flooded the rooms with natural light and built-in bookshelves that reminded me of my grandmother's home. It wasn't extravagant, but it represented a meaningful step up from the succession of shared apartments that had defined my adult life. On moving day, as I arranged my sparse belongings in the new space, I finally allowed myself to feel genuine excitement about this new chapter. The condo wasn't just a place to live. It was the first tangible manifestation of the security my grandmother had provided. I placed her photograph on the mantel, positioning it so her smile would be the first thing I saw upon entering the living room. "I'm trying to be wise, Grandma," I whispered to her image. "I hope you'd approve." True to her advice, I kept the inheritance private. My parents had divorced when I was 12, both remarrying and starting new families. Our relationships were cordial but distant, maintained through obligatory holiday calls and occasional emails. Neither had been particularly close to my grandmother in the years before her passing, their connections strained by old conflicts and divergent life paths. I saw no reason to volunteer information about my changed circumstances. The only person I considered telling was my older brother, James. Despite the 7-year age gap between us, we'd been close as children, united by the chaos of our parents' tumultuous marriage and subsequent divorces. James had been my protector, the one who made sure I had lunch money and signed permission slips when our parents were too absorbed in their own dramas to notice. Our relationship had evolved as we entered adulthood. James had married young to his high school sweetheart, Melissa, and they now had 3 children, twins who had just started elementary school and a 3-year-old. He worked as a project manager for a construction company, and while they weren't struggling, the combination of a large family, a substantial mortgage, and Melissa's decision to be a stay-at-home mother meant their finances were perpetually stretched. We still spoke regularly, though our conversations increasingly centered around his family's activities and challenges, rather than the shared confidences of our youth. I treasured my role as Aunt Charlie to his children, spoiling them with modest gifts and attention whenever possible. 6 weeks after moving into my new condo, I invited James and his family for dinner, eager to share at least this visible change in my life. I spent the day preparing, making homemade pasta and sauce using our grandmother's recipe, arranging fresh flowers, and setting the table with new dishware I'd finally replaced after years of making do with mismatched thrift store finds. They arrived in their usual whirlwind of energy, the twins, Emma and Ethan, immediately exploring every corner of the condo while 3-year-old Noah clung to Melissa's leg, regarding me with solemn eyes until I produced the stuffed dinosaur I'd bought specifically to win his favor. "This place is gorgeous, Charlie," Melissa exclaimed, handing me a bottle of wine. "How on earth can you afford it on your own? The market downtown is insane these days." I noticed James glancing around with a slightly furrowed brow, taking in the new furniture and updated appliances. "I got a promotion," I lied, the words tasting bitter even as I spoke them. "And the owner is an older woman who preferred a reliable tenant over maximum profit. Right place, right time." James nodded, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Lucky break?" he commented. "We've been trying to find a place with an extra bedroom now that the twins are getting older, but everything in decent school districts is completely out of reach." Dinner progressed pleasantly enough, with the conversation dominated by stories of the children's school adventures and James's latest work project. I felt a familiar pang as I watched him with his family. Despite the financial stress evident in the tired lines around his eyes, he'd created something beautiful, a cohesive unit bound by genuine love and shared purpose. After dessert, when Melissa took the children into the living room to watch a movie I'd queued up, James helped me clear the table. In the relative privacy of the kitchen, he leaned against the counter, fixing me with the penetrating look I remembered from childhood, the one that always preceded his big brother knows best talks. "So, new job, new apartment, new furniture?" he said casually. "That's a lot of change all at once for someone who's been living like a college student for years." I busied myself loading the dishwasher, avoiding his eyes. I decided it was time for an upgrade. "I'm almost 27, James. I can't have roommates and secondhand everything forever." He picked up a dish towel, methodically drying the serving platters I'd hand-washed. "And this has nothing to do with Grandma Eleanor's estate being settled?" My hands stilled in the soapy water, heart suddenly pounding. "What do you mean?" "Dad mentioned something about it last time we talked. Said Uncle Robert was handling the paperwork, dividing up her assets. Nothing substantial, he thought. Maybe a few thousand each once the house sold." James watched me carefully. "But that was months ago, and I haven't heard anything since." Relief washed through me. They didn't know the specifics, just that there had been some anticipated inheritance. "There was a small amount," I acknowledged, deciding a partial truth was better than an outright lie. "Enough to help with the security deposit and some furniture. Nothing life-changing." James seemed to accept this explanation, nodding slowly. "That makes sense. I figured we'd have heard if it was anything significant." He paused, then added quietly, "We could have used even a small boost. Noah's preschool tuition just went up again, and the twins need braces sooner than we expected." The familiar guilt twisted in my stomach, the same guilt I'd felt throughout childhood when I'd received our grandmother's attention and gifts while James, already considered grown up, had been expected to fend for himself. Despite being the older sibling, he'd often gone without so that I could have what I needed. "I'm sorry," I said, genuinely meaning it. "I know things are tight for you guys right now." He shrugged, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We manage. That's what adults do, right? Make it work no matter what." The evening ended warmly enough, with promises to get together again soon. As I hugged each of my nieces and nephews goodbye, I slipped James an envelope containing $500, money I'd previously set aside from my regular salary, not the inheritance, with a note saying it was for the children's upcoming expenses. "Just a little bonus I got at work," I explained when he tried to refuse. "Please take it. I don't have kids to spend it on, and those three deserve the world." After they left, I sat alone in my new living room, the quiet almost oppressive after the cheerful chaos of their visit. My grandmother's warning about keeping the inheritance private echoed in my mind, along with the image of James's tired eyes and proud stance. I wondered if I'd made the right decision in concealing the full truth from him. Was I protecting the integrity of my grandmother's wishes, or was I simply avoiding a difficult conversation? What I couldn't possibly know that evening was how quickly this question would be answered, or how dramatically the dynamics of our relationship would shift once the truth inevitably emerged. The foundation of my new life still felt tentative, a delicate construction of decisions and boundaries that I was only beginning to navigate. In the months to come, those boundaries would be tested in ways I couldn't yet imagine, forcing me to define not just what I owed to others, but what I owed to myself. As autumn painted the city in brilliant hues of amber and crimson, my life settled into a new rhythm. At work, I continued to excel, earning a genuine promotion 3 months after I'd fabricated one to explain my improved circumstances. My supervisor cited my increased confidence and innovative approaches to client challenges, qualities I recognized as the fruits of reduced financial stress. When you're not constantly calculating whether you can afford both groceries and electricity, in the same week your mind finds space for creativity and growth. I began allocating one evening each week to financial education, determined to honor my grandmother's trust by becoming a knowledgeable steward of her gift. Mrs. Reynolds recommended books and online courses, occasionally meeting me for coffee to answer questions and offer guidance. Under her mentorship, I developed a deeper understanding not just of investment strategies and tax implications, but of the psychology of wealth, how money influences decisions, relationships, and self-perception. The greatest challenge for many who suddenly acquire wealth, she told me during one of our conversations, isn't managing the money itself, but managing how it changes their relationship with themselves and others. Her words proved prophetic when, in early November, I received an unexpected call from my father. We hadn't spoken since a brief, awkward exchange on my birthday 2 months earlier, making the sudden outreach unusual. "Charlotte," he boomed. When I answered, his voice carrying the forced joviality I associated with him wanting something. "How's my successful daughter? James mentioned you got a big promotion and a fancy new place downtown." I winced at the description, but responded pleasantly enough, asking about him and his wife, Diane. After minimal pleasantries, he cleared his throat, the sound that had always preceded uncomfortable conversations throughout my childhood. "Listen, sweetheart, I'm calling because I've run into a bit of a situation. Diane's mother needs specialized care. Her Parkinson's is progressing faster than expected, and we're looking at significant out-of-pocket costs. I was wondering if you might be in a position to help out, given your recent career success." The request caught me off guard. My father had never asked me for money before. In fact, our unspoken agreement had always been a careful avoidance of financial discussions. I knew he and Diane lived comfortably, with a house in the suburbs and annual vacations to Florida. His request suggested either the costs were truly substantial, or he had gained an inflated impression of my means. "I'm sorry to hear about Diane's mother," I said carefully. "How much are you looking for?" "Well, the specialized facility runs about $12,000 a month, and insurance only covers part. We're thinking of selling the boat to cover the first few months, but if you could manage, say, $5,000 to help with the transition costs, it would really make a difference." $5,000. Before the inheritance, such a sum would have been impossible. My emergency fund had rarely exceeded $2,000. Now it represented a minor withdrawal from my new account. Yet something in my father's presumption, the ease with which he asked, after years of minimal involvement in my life, made me hesitate. "I'll need to look at my finances," I replied, non-committal. The promotion came with more responsibility than actual money, and the new place took most of my savings. My father's disappointment transmitted clearly even through the phone. "I understand. Whatever you can do would be appreciated. Family helps family, right?" After we hung up, I sat with my discomfort, trying to parse the complex emotions his request had triggered. It wasn't the money itself. I could easily provide the requested amount without impact to my financial security. Rather, it was the sudden shift in how he viewed me, the immediate assumption that my apparent prosperity created an obligation to solve his problems. I called Mrs. Reynolds the next day, seeking her perspective on the situation. "The question isn't whether you can afford to give the money," she said after listening to my explanation. "It's whether doing so aligns with your values and boundaries. Consider also the precedent it sets. If you provide this sum easily, what expectations might follow?" Her questions helped clarify my thinking. After careful consideration, I decided to send my father $2,000, a meaningful contribution that acknowledged family ties without suggesting unlimited access to my resources. I transferred the money with a note expressing sympathy for Diane's mother and explaining this was what I could manage given my current obligations. My father's response was brief, a terse thank you that carried clear disappointment at the amount, confirming my suspicion that his perception of my circumstances had been significantly distorted. The exchange left me uneasy, but it was merely a prelude to the more consequential conversation that awaited me. 2 weeks later, James called, asking if we could meet for coffee during his lunch break. His tone carried an unusual formality that set alarm bells ringing, but I agreed, suggesting a cafe near his office. James arrived looking more polished than usual in a crisp button-down and dress pants, his construction company lanyard tucked into his pocket. After ordering and finding a quiet corner table, he dispensed with small talk, leaning forward with intent. "I had an interesting conversation with Dad yesterday," he began, stirring his coffee methodically. "He mentioned asking you for help with Diane's mother's care costs." I nodded cautiously. "He did. I sent what I could." $2,000, James stated, watching me closely. "That's quite generous for someone on an analyst's salary, even with a promotion." The implied question hung between us. I sipped my latte, buying time as I considered my response. "I've been good with my savings," I offered finally. "And I don't have the expenses you do. No children, no mortgage." James continued to study me, the big brother scrutiny that had so often penetrated my childhood deceptions. "Charlie, I've been thinking about Grandma Eleanor's estate. It seems odd that we haven't heard anything official about the distribution. Dad assumed it was minimal, but..." He paused. "Grandma adored you. She practically raised you after the divorce. It would make sense if she left you something significant." My pulse quickened. James had always been perceptive, especially when it came to family dynamics. "Why are you asking about this now?" I countered, deflecting rather than directly lying. His expression softened slightly. "Because Melissa's pregnant again." The news hit me like a physical blow. Joy for their growing family immediately followed by understanding of the financial implications. 4 children on a single income would stretch their resources beyond their already tight limits. "James, that's wonderful news," I said sincerely. "When is she due?" "June." His smile was genuine but tinged with visible anxiety. "It wasn't exactly planned, but we're happy. Terrified, but happy." "Congratulations." I reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "You're an amazing father. This baby is lucky to be joining your family." He acknowledged the compliment with a nod before steering the conversation back to his original point. "The thing is, Charlie, with another child coming, we're in a tight spot. The house is already too small, the car is on its last legs, and Melissa's going to need proper prenatal care, especially given her age and it being her fourth pregnancy. He paused, seemingly gathering courage. If Grandma did leave you a substantial inheritance, I'm hoping you might consider sharing some of it for the kids. The directness of his request, however gently delivered, caught me off guard. This wasn't my father's entitled assumption, but my brother's genuine need, weighted with our shared history and his years of protection when I'd been vulnerable. What makes you think there was anything substantial? I asked, stalling. Little things. Your sudden move to a downtown condo, new furniture, the ease with which you gave me $500 for the kids. Plus, you've seemed different lately. Calmer, more confident, like someone who isn't counting pennies for the first time in their life. His perception was uncomfortably accurate. I considered continuing the deception, maintaining the fiction, of modest means and career-based advancement, but the prospect of ongoing lies to my brother felt increasingly untenable. There was an inheritance, I admitted finally, lowering my voice despite the cafe's ambient noise. Grandma established a trust fund for me years ago. I only learned about it after she passed. James's expression registered surprise, followed quickly by something more complex, a mixture of validation at having his suspicions confirmed and the beginning edges of calculation. How much? He asked, his voice equally hushed. I hesitated, remembering my grandmother's explicit warning about privacy. Enough to make a difference in my financial security. I'm still working, still living relatively modestly. Mrs. Reynolds, the trust manager, advised me to take time to adjust before making any major changes. Mrs. Reynolds, James repeated, a slight edge entering his tone. So there's a professional manager involved. That suggests we're not talking about a few $1,000s. I shifted uncomfortably. James, just tell me, Charlie. We're family. No secrets, remember? That was our pact growing up. The invocation of our childhood agreement, formed during the darkest days of our parents' divorce when information had been currency and protection, struck a chord. I took a deep breath and decided on a partial truth. The trust is valued at over $1 million, I said, deliberately understating the actual amount. But it's structured for long-term financial security, not immediate access to cash. There are tax implications, investment considerations. It's complicated. James's eyes widened, his coffee forgotten as he processed this information. $1 million, he echoed, the figure clearly exceeding even his highest estimates. And Grandma left it all to you? Nothing for me or the kids? The hurt in his question was palpable, the implicit accusation clear. Why you and not us? The same question that had shadowed our relationship since childhood, when our grandmother had focused her attention and resources primarily on me while expecting James, as the older sibling, to demonstrate independence. I don't think it was about favoritism, I said carefully. Grandma established the trust when I was very young, after the divorce. You were already a teenager, preparing for college. Her letter suggested she wanted to ensure I had security given how unstable our family situation was. James nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. I understand that. But now, knowing what you have, surely you can see how this changes things. My kids, your nieces and nephews, are struggling while you're sitting on a fortune. His framing made me flinch. I wouldn't call it a fortune. And I'm trying to be responsible with it, to honor Grandma's wishes. And what about honoring family obligations? He pressed. Emma needs specialized testing for her learning difficulties. The twins' school is cutting their arts program, so they'll need private lessons to continue their music education. Noah's preschool costs are killing us, and now with another baby coming. He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. We're drowning, Charlie, while you're living alone in a downtown condo with $1 million in the bank. The guilt his words evoked was powerful, rooted in decades of family dynamics and the genuine love I felt for his children. Yet alongside it grew a sense of unease at how quickly our relationship had shifted, how immediately my inheritance had transformed me from sister to potential solution to his financial problems. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "It's not as simple as writing a check. There are structures to the trust, and I'm still learning how to manage it properly." James's expression hardened slightly. "Don't overthink it, Charlie. This is family. Grandma would want you to help us. You know she would. She adored the kids." As our coffee grew cold and the lunch hour waned, I promised to consider his situation carefully and be in touch soon. We parted with an awkward hug, the easy camaraderie of our previous interactions noticeably diminished. Walking back to my office, I felt the weight of his expectations pressing on me like a physical burden. The inheritance that had represented freedom now carried complications I hadn't anticipated, forcing me to navigate not just financial decisions, but emotional terrain I was ill-prepared to traverse. What had begun as a private blessing was rapidly becoming a public test of character, family loyalty, and personal boundaries, a test for which I had no clear answers, only the growing certainty that whatever decisions I made would irrevocably alter the course of relationships I had long taken for granted. The weeks following my coffee with James brought a flurry of text messages and calls from family members I hadn't heard from in months, sometimes years. My father, emboldened by the knowledge that I had significant resources, called twice more with thinly veiled requests for additional financial support for Diane's mother's care. My stepmother sent a lengthy email detailing the emotional toll of caregiving, pointedly mentioning how family support makes all the difference. Even my mother, who had relocated to Arizona with her third husband years ago, suddenly expressed interest in visiting, casually mentioning in the same conversation that their retirement investments had taken an unexpected downturn. The pattern was unmistakable. James had shared the information about my inheritance, and now I had transformed in my family's eyes from the struggling younger daughter to a potential solution to their financial concerns. Rather than immediately responding to these overtures, I scheduled another meeting with Mrs. Reynolds, seeking guidance on navigating this new territory. "This development isn't surprising," she said as we sat in her office, December sunlight streaming through the windows. In fact, Eleanor anticipated it. It's one of the reasons she advised keeping the inheritance private initially. "I shouldn't have told James," I admitted, massaging my temples. "I knew Grandma wanted me to keep it confidential, but he's my brother. We've always been honest with each other." Mrs. Reynolds regarded me with sympathetic understanding. "Family relationships are complicated, especially where money is concerned. The question now is how you'll respond to these requests while maintaining both your financial security and your personal boundaries. That's just it. I don't know how to respond. James has legitimate needs for his children. My father's request involves medical care for my step-grandmother. These aren't frivolous demands." "Perhaps," Mrs. Reynolds acknowledged. "But legitimate needs don't automatically translate to your responsibility. Your grandmother entrusted this money to you specifically, with clear intentions about providing for your future." She pulled a file from her drawer, opening it to reveal documentation I hadn't seen before. "Eleanor left something else for you that I was instructed to provide when the time seemed right. I believe that time has come." She handed me a sealed envelope similar to the one I'd received upon first learning of the inheritance. Inside was another letter in my grandmother's handwriting, dated just 3 months before her passing. "My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this second letter, it means that others have discovered your inheritance and begun making claims upon it. This was, unfortunately, inevitable, and it represents the first significant test of your stewardship. I want to be clear about something. This trust was established for you, not for your parents who made their choices and must live with the consequences. Not for your brother, whom I love dearly, but who has followed a different path with different priorities. And not for extended family members who may suddenly discover their connection to you once your circumstances change. This may sound harsh, but it reflects hard-won wisdom. Throughout my life, I watched money destroy relationships when boundaries weren't firmly established. I saw generosity exploited until it became expectation, then entitlement, then resentment, when limits were finally set. You may choose to help family members in specific, limited ways: education for nieces and nephews, emergency medical expenses, one-time assistance for genuine crises, but do so thoughtfully, with clear parameters, and no expectation of managing their ongoing financial lives. Remember, giving people money rarely solves their underlying problems. Those who struggle financially often do so because of patterns and decisions that will persist regardless of temporary influxes of cash. Trust your judgment, Charlotte. You have always possessed wisdom beyond your years, and I have absolute faith in your ability to navigate these waters with both compassion and appropriate boundaries. All my love, Grandma Eleanor tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. Even from beyond, my grandmother was still guiding me, still protecting me with her foresight and wisdom. She knew this would happen, I whispered, carefully refolding the letter. Eleanor understood human nature, Mrs. Reynolds confirmed. She also understood the particular dynamics of your family. That's why she structured the trust with specific protections. What kind of protections? Mrs. Reynolds smiled. For one, the trust has provisions that prevent large lump sum withdrawals without appropriate review. Any significant distribution requires documentation and approval. This isn't to restrict your access, but to provide a buffer against pressure or impulsive decisions. So, even if I wanted to give James half the money right now, I couldn't? Not without a formal process. That would take time and scrutiny. Eleanor designed it this way deliberately, creating a structure that would support your ability to say no when necessary. This revelation brought an unexpected sense of relief. My grandmother hadn't just provided financial resources. She had created a framework to help me manage the psychological and emotional challenges that accompanied them. Armed with this new perspective, I developed a strategy for addressing my family's escalating requests. I would offer limited, targeted assistance for specific needs related to the children's education and well-being, but not ongoing financial support or large cash transfers. I would maintain clear boundaries while still honoring family connections in ways that aligned with my values and my grandmother's intentions. The opportunity to implement this approach came sooner than expected. 3 days before Christmas, James called, his voice tense with barely contained urgency. "Charlie, we need to talk. Can I come over tonight?" Something in his tone put me on alert. "I have plans this evening," I lied, needing time to prepare. "How about tomorrow afternoon?" "You could come by around 2. He agreed reluctantly, and I spent the intervening hours reviewing my financial plan with renewed determination. When James arrived the following day, his familiar knock now carried an unfamiliar weight. I opened the door to find not just James, but Melissa as well, her pregnancy now visible beneath her winter coat. Their presence together signaled the seriousness of whatever discussion they had planned. "This is a surprise," I said, gesturing them inside. "I didn't realize you were joining us, Melissa?" "This concerns both of us," she replied, her typically warm demeanor replaced by a focused intensity I hadn't witnessed before. Once settled in my living room with coffee and the Christmas cookies I'd baked the previous evening, James launched directly into the purpose of their visit. "We've been doing a lot of thinking and planning since learning about your inheritance," he began, exchanging a glance with Melissa. "With the new baby coming, we've realized our current situation is completely unsustainable. The house is too small, our car isn't reliable enough for a family of 6, and the kids' educational needs are only going to increase." Melissa picked up seamlessly where he left off. "We've found a solution that would address all these issues. a 4-bedroom house in Lakeview Estates. It's in the best school district in the county, with programs that would be perfect for Emma's learning needs, and advanced options for Ethan's math abilities. There's even a wonderful Montessori preschool nearby for Noah and eventually the new baby. That sounds ideal, I said cautiously, already sensing where this conversation was heading. James nodded eagerly. It is. The timing is perfect too. The sellers are motivated and we've been pre-approved for a mortgage, but we need help with the down payment, Melissa finished. The house is $675,000, and we'd need at least 20% down to make the monthly payments manageable with James's salary. The implication was clear. They were asking for $135,000, a sum that represented a significant portion of the liquid assets in my trust. That's a substantial amount, I said carefully. It is, James acknowledged, leaning forward. But Charlie, think about what it means for the kids, your nieces and nephews. This isn't about luxury. It's about giving them the foundation they deserve. The same kind of foundation Grandma wanted to give you with the trust fund. His framing was masterful, drawing a direct parallel between my grandmother's intentions for me and what they were requesting for their children. It tugged at my sense of family obligation and the genuine love I felt for those children. We've worked out all the details, Melissa added, pulling a folder from her bag and spreading papers across my coffee table. Printouts of the house listing, school information, a carefully prepared budget. James would pick up weekend construction jobs to cover the increased property taxes. I'd start working part-time once the baby is a year old to help with the mortgage. This isn't a handout. It's an investment in the children's future. The thoroughness of their preparation revealed how much thought they'd put into this plan, a plan that positioned me as the key to its fulfillment. I studied the materials silently, noting the beautiful house with its spacious yard, the impressive school statistics, the meticulously calculated budget that still relied on best-case scenarios and left minimal margin for unexpected expenses. I understand why this opportunity seems perfect, I said finally. And I appreciate how carefully you've considered the logistics. But I need to be honest with you both. I can't provide $135,000 for a down payment. Their expressions shifted, simultaneously from hopeful anticipation to stunned disbelief. What do you mean you can't? James asked, his tone sharpening. You have over $1 million. This isn't even 15% of that. The trust isn't structured for large withdrawals like that, I explained, drawing on Mrs. Reynolds's guidance. There are provisions that limit how much can be accessed at once, especially in the first few years. This wasn't entirely accurate. I could theoretically access the funds with proper documentation and justification, but it provided a necessary buffer against their expectations. That doesn't make sense, Melissa interjected, her voice rising slightly. It's your money. If you wanted to help your family, surely there's a way around whatever restrictions exist. It's not that simple, I maintained. Grandma established specific parameters for the trust's management. But more importantly, I've been giving this a lot of thought, and while I want to help your family, I don't believe a massive one-time payment is the right approach. James's expression hardened. So you're saying no? You're going to let your brother's family struggle while you live in comfort because of some arbitrary parameters? His framing stung, but I held firm. I'm not saying no to helping. I'm saying no to this particular request in this particular form. What I'd like to propose instead is establishing college funds for each of the children, including the new baby. I could contribute $5,000 initially to each fund and add $2,500 annually. That would give them a significant educational foundation by the time they're ready for college. College is years away, Melissa objected. We need help now, with their formative education and living situation. I understand that, I acknowledged, which is why I'd also be willing to pay for Emma's specialized educational assessments and any therapy or tutoring she needs. Additionally, I could help with certain extracurricular activities for all the children, music lessons, sports, summer camps, up to a reasonable annual amount. My proposals were met with visible disappointment. The specific, bounded offers I was making fell far short of the transformative financial intervention they had envisioned. "This isn't what we expected from you, Charlie," James said, his voice low with barely contained frustration. "Not after everything we've been through together, everything I did for you growing up." The implied obligation hung heavy in the air. I took a deep breath, acknowledging both the truth in his statement and the manipulation embedded within it. "I love you, James. I love your children, and I'm genuinely committed to supporting their well-being and development in ways that are sustainable and responsible. But I need to honor the trust Grandma placed in me by managing this inheritance with the same care and foresight she demonstrated in creating it." As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, the tension between us was palpable. This conversation had fundamentally altered our relationship, creating a divide that would require time and perspective to bridge. Standing at my door, James turned back, his expression a complex mixture of disappointment and determination. "This isn't over, Charlie. Those kids deserve better, and if you won't help provide it, we'll find another way." His words carried an ominous quality that lingered long after they departed, leaving me alone in my condo with the weight of unmet expectations and the uncertainty of what another way might entail. January arrived with bitter cold and relentless snow, mirroring the chill that had settled over my relationship with James. Since our confrontation before Christmas, we'd exchanged only perfunctory text messages, terse holiday greetings, and a brief update when Melissa had an early prenatal appointment. The easy camaraderie we'd shared throughout our lives had been replaced by strained formality that pained me deeply. I sent gift cards for the children's birthdays and continued making monthly contributions to the college funds I'd established for them, despite James and Melissa's lukewarm response to this gesture. These transactions felt hollow, reduced to financial exchanges rather than expressions of genuine connection, but I remained committed to supporting my nieces and nephews even as the relationship with their parents grew increasingly distant. At work, I channeled my emotional turmoil into professional advancement, securing 2 major accounts that positioned me for potential partnership track, an achievement that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. My colleagues noticed the change in my performance and confidence, attributing it to natural growth rather than the invisible safety net that allowed me to take calculated risks without fear of catastrophic consequences. One Wednesday afternoon in late January, I was deep in preparation for a client presentation when my assistant informed me that someone named Robert Winters was in the reception area asking to see me. "Uncle Robert?" I hadn't seen my father's older brother in years, not since my grandmother's funeral. Unlike my father, who had drifted through a series of jobs and relationships, Uncle Robert had built a successful law practice specializing in estate planning and probate. His relationship with my grandmother had been complex, marked by mutual respect, but also by long-standing disagreements about family matters. Curious and slightly apprehensive, I asked my assistant to show him to the small conference room adjacent to my office. Uncle Robert looked much as I remembered, tall and distinguished with silver hair and the same deep-set eyes that had passed through generations of the Winters family. His expression was grave as he shook my hand. "Charlotte, thank you for seeing me without notice. I apologize for the intrusion, but the matter is rather urgent." "It's good to see you, Uncle Robert," I replied, gesturing for him to sit. "Is everything all right? I don't think we've spoken since Grandma's funeral." He placed his leather briefcase on the table, his movements deliberate. "I wish this were merely a social call to reconnect with my niece. Unfortunately, I'm here on a matter concerning your grandmother's estate, specifically the trust fund established in your name." My stomach tightened. "What about it?" "I've been contacted by your brother, James," he explained, removing several documents from his briefcase. He has raised concerns about the distribution of Eleanor's assets, suggesting there may have been undue influence or diminished capacity involved in her decision to establish the trust solely for your benefit. The implication hit me like a physical blow. He's contesting Grandma's will? Her trust decisions? Not officially yet, Uncle Robert clarified. He's consulted with an attorney who specializes in trust disputes. They're exploring grounds for a legal challenge based on several claims that Eleanor may not have been of sound mind when making these arrangements, that she was potentially influenced by third parties, or that the trust violates family expectations by excluding direct descendants. That's absurd, I protested, heat rising to my face. Grandma established the trust when I was 6 years old, decades before her passing. She was completely lucid, and she updated the terms periodically throughout her life. There was no undue influence, it was her explicit choice. Uncle Robert held up a placating hand. I'm well aware, Charlotte. I was involved in the initial establishment of the trust, though Patricia Reynolds took over its management several years ago. Eleanor's competence and intentions were well documented and legally sound. His confirmation provided momentary relief, but confusion quickly followed. If you know the trust is legally unassailable, why are you here? Because legal validity doesn't prevent costly, time-consuming litigation that could freeze assets during proceedings and create significant family discord. He sighed, the weight of decades of Winter's family dynamics evident in his expression. James has also contacted your father, who seems inclined to support the challenge on the grounds that Eleanor's decision disrupted natural inheritance patterns and created unjust enrichment. The betrayal stung sharply. Despite our complicated relationship, I hadn't expected my father to actively support an attack on my inheritance, especially one based on false premises about my grandmother's mental capacity. So what happens now? I asked, struggling to maintain professional composure despite the turmoil roiling within me. That depends largely on how you wish to proceed, Uncle Robert replied. You could fight any legal challenge, which you would likely win eventually given the clear documentation of Eleanor's intentions. However, this would involve significant legal expenses, potential temporary restrictions on access to the trust during proceedings, and further deterioration of family relationships. And the alternatives? I prompted, sensing there was more to his visit than simply delivering bad news. Uncle Robert straightened in his chair. I have a proposal that might avoid litigation while still respecting Eleanor's fundamental wishes. Before I outline it, however, I want to clarify something important. I'm not here as James's representative or advocate. My concern is honoring my sister's intentions while preventing a family implosion she would have deeply regretted. I nodded, recognizing the difficult position he occupied, connected to all parties but with primary loyalty to my grandmother's legacy. Eleanor confided in me extensively about her financial planning, he continued. She was absolutely clear that the trust was intended for your security and advancement, not as a slush fund for extended family. However, she did express certain hopes regarding your nieces and nephews. This captured my attention immediately. What hopes specifically? She believed deeply in education as a transformative force. While she didn't include specific provisions for James's children in the trust, she mentioned several times that she hoped you would eventually support their educational pursuits if the need arose. This aligned perfectly with the college funds I had already established, a validation of my approach that brought unexpected comfort. I've already set up educational funds for all 4 children, I explained. James and Melissa were disappointed because they wanted a large sum for a house down payment instead. Uncle Robert nodded thoughtfully. That confirms what I suspected. Their financial pressures are real, but their approach, attempting to access a substantial portion of your trust through emotional leverage and now legal threats, runs counter to Eleanor's explicit intentions. He opened another folder, revealing what appeared to be a draft agreement. My proposal is this: a formal family settlement that would establish clear parameters for limited, education-focused support for James's children, while explicitly acknowledging the trust is your separate property not subject to further claims or litigation. I studied the document with growing interest. Rather than the ambiguous, open-ended financial relationship James and Melissa had envisioned, this agreement would create specific, limited obligations, annual contributions to the established college, funds, coverage for educational assessments and interventions when professionally recommended, and support for academic enrichment activities up to a defined annual amount. In essence, Uncle Robert explained, this formalizes exactly what you've already offered, but with legal clarity that prevents future disputes while honoring both your grandmother's wishes and legitimate family connections. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity and protection. Would James accept this? It's essentially what he already rejected as insufficient. That's where I come in, Uncle Robert said, a hint of the formidable attorney emerging in his tone. I've requested a meeting with James, his attorney, and Patricia Reynolds next week. As the executor of Eleanor's estate and someone intimately familiar with her intentions, I can provide authoritative context about the legal strength of the trust and the risks of pursuing litigation. He leaned forward slightly. Charlotte, family disputes over inheritance are rarely about the money alone. They're about perceived fairness, historical grievances, and unspoken expectations. James feels overlooked, a pattern that began in childhood, when circumstances required him to be the responsible one, while Eleanor focused additional resources on you after the divorce. His insight struck a chord. Throughout our childhood, James had received praise for his independence and maturity, while I had received tangible support and protection. The inheritance had merely crystallized this long-standing dynamic. I understand that, I acknowledged, and I genuinely want to help his family. I just can't allow their financial challenges to become my primary responsibility or compromise the security Grandma worked so hard to provide. Exactly, Uncle Robert agreed. This agreement creates meaningful support without endless obligation. It honors connections without creating dependency. Most importantly, it transforms an adversarial situation into a structured solution that benefits the next generation. The wisdom of his approach was undeniable. Rather than engaging in a destructive legal battle that would devastate relationships and deplete resources, he was offering a path that maintained boundaries while acknowledging legitimate family ties. There's one more thing you should know, Uncle Robert added, his expression softening slightly. James didn't initiate this legal exploration entirely on his own. He's been encouraged rather forcefully by your father, who stands to gain nothing. Direct from this challenge but seems determined to insert himself nevertheless. This revelation shifted my perspective significantly. My father's involvement suggested that James's actions weren't solely driven by his own financial pressures, but influenced by someone who had long harbored resentment toward my grandmother's independent decisions. Why would Dad push for this? I wondered aloud. He and Grandma were barely on speaking terms for years. Robert and Eleanor had a complicated relationship, Uncle Robert observed, referring to my father by his first name. He often felt she judged his choices too harshly, while she believed he repeatedly prioritized immediate gratification over long-term stability, particularly regarding his children's welfare. This situation likely represents unresolved feelings about her disapproval, as much as any concern for James's circumstances. The insight helped clarify the complex family dynamics at play. What had initially seemed like a straightforward dispute between my brother and me was actually layered with decades of intergenerational tensions and unresolved conflicts. I'll support your proposal, I decided, recognizing its wisdom. It provides meaningful help to the children while establishing necessary boundaries. Uncle Robert nodded approvingly. I'll arrange the meeting and represent your interests alongside Mrs. Reynolds. In the meantime, continue your educational support for the children but avoid additional financial discussions with James or your father until we've formalized the agreement. As he gathered his materials to leave, I was struck by the unexpected alliance that had formed. My grandmother's brother becoming the protector of her intentions, and my advocate in navigating the complex terrain of family financial entanglements. "Uncle Robert," I said as we stood, "why are you doing this? You could have simply let the situation unfold without involvement." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "Eleanor and I didn't always agree, but we shared fundamental values about financial responsibility and family legacy. She entrusted you with resources because she believed in your judgment and character." His gaze met mine directly. "I'm involved because I share that belief, and because I've seen too many families destroyed by inheritance disputes that could have been resolved with clear boundaries and mutual respect." After he departed, I returned to my office, my mind reeling from this unexpected development. The trust that had initially seemed like pure blessing had become the catalyst for revealing family dynamics that had simmered beneath the surface for decades. Yet amid the tension and uncertainty, I recognized something important. My grandmother's gift wasn't merely financial. It was an opportunity to establish healthier patterns, to break cycles of entitlement and obligation that had shadowed my family for generations. The challenge wasn't simply protecting the monetary value of the inheritance, but honoring its deeper purpose, creating genuine security and independence that would allow me to support others from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. With renewed determination, I returned to my work preparations, recognizing that the skills that had advanced my career, analytical thinking, strategic planning, principled negotiation, would serve me equally well in navigating this personal challenge. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since James's initial request, I felt equipped to traverse it with both compassion and conviction. The conference room at Meridian Financial Services exuded quiet professionalism. Tasteful artwork adorning cream-colored walls, a polished mahogany table reflecting the recessed lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. I arrived 15 minutes early at Mrs. Reynolds' suggestion, allowing us time to review our approach before the others arrived. "Remember," she advised as we settled into adjacent chairs, "this meeting isn't about convincing James that you care about his children. It's about establishing clear parameters that honor both your grandmother's intentions and your genuine family connections without creating unsustainable expectations." I nodded, appreciating her framing. Since Uncle Robert's visit the previous week, I'd vacillated between anxiety about the confrontation ahead and determination to establish a resolution that would serve everyone's long-term interests. "The key is maintaining emotional composure," Mrs. Reynolds continued. "Family financial discussions often devolve into historical grievances and emotional manipulation. Your role is to remain focused on forward-looking solutions rather than past resentments." At precisely 2:00, the receptionist escorted Uncle Robert into the conference room. He was accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize, tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, her demeanor projecting practiced authority. "My associate, Vanessa Mitchell," Uncle Robert explained. "She specializes in family trust mediation and has extensive experience navigating precisely these types of situations." Before I could respond, the door opened again to admit James. He entered with evident tension in his shoulders, followed by a younger man carrying a leather portfolio, who introduced himself as Timothy Grayson, James's attorney. I searched my brother's face for some acknowledgement of our shared history, some flicker of the connection that had sustained us through childhood difficulties, but his expression remained guardedly neutral as he took a seat across the table. Mrs. Reynolds began with a succinct overview of my grandmother's trust, its establishment when I was 6 years old, its periodic updates and reaffirmations throughout her life, and the clear documentation of her intentions regarding its purpose and management. "The legal standing of the trust is unambiguous," she concluded. "It was established with sound mind and clear intent, with multiple witnesses and proper documentation throughout its existence. While family members may have emotional expectations regarding Eleanor Winters' assets, the legal reality is that she deliberately and consistently designated these specific resources for Charlotte's benefit. Timothy Grayson shifted in his seat, his expression suggesting he'd hoped for more vulnerability in the trust structure. While the documentation appears thorough, he countered, there remains the question of family obligation and reasonable expectations. Estates of this magnitude typically include provisions for multiple generations, particularly direct descendants like Mr. Winters's children. Typically has no legal relevance here, Vanessa Mitchell interjected smoothly. Eleanor Winters was under no obligation to distribute her assets according to any predetermined pattern. She made specific, documented choices about the management of her resources, choices that were hers alone to make. I watched James's reaction carefully, noting the slight tightening of his jaw. This wasn't proceeding as he had anticipated. Rather than finding leverage to challenge the trust, he was confronting the reality that my grandmother's decisions, however personally disappointing to him, were legally sound. Uncle Robert seized this moment to redirect the conversation. We're not here to litigate Eleanor's choices, he stated firmly. That path leads only to significant legal expenses, frozen assets during proceedings, and irreparable family damage. We're here to explore a constructive solution that acknowledges legitimate family connections while respecting Eleanor's clearly established intentions. He distributed copies of the settlement agreement he had drafted, the document now refined, with input from Mrs. Reynolds and Ms. Mitchell. This proposal creates a structured approach to supporting James's children's educational needs without compromising the fundamental integrity of Charlotte's trust. As James and his attorney reviewed the document, I studied my brother's face, the familiar features that had aged with the responsibilities of parenthood and financial stress. Despite the current tension between us, I could still see glimpses of the protective older brother who had helped me navigate our fractured childhood. That connection made the current adversarial position all the more painful. Timothy Grayson looked up from the document, his expression calculating. This proposal essentially formalizes the limited support Ms. Winters had already offered, support my client previously deemed insufficient for his family's needs. It provides substantial educational resources for all 4 children, Mrs. Reynolds countered. College funds with initial contributions and annual additions, coverage for educational assessments and interventions, support for academic enrichment activities. These commitments represent significant financial support, focused specifically on the children's development and future opportunities. But nothing for immediate housing needs, James interjected, his first direct contribution to the conversation. 4 growing children in a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom and no dedicated study space. That's our daily reality while Charlotte lives alone in a luxury condo. The characterization stung, but I maintained my composure, remembering Mrs. Reynolds's advice about emotional manipulation. James, I said, addressing him directly for the first time, my condo is modest by any objective standard, and it was purchased with careful consideration of my long-term financial security. The educational support outlined in this agreement represents the most sustainable way I can help your children without compromising the primary purpose of Grandma's trust. Uncle Robert nodded approvingly at my measured response before addressing James. Consider the alternative path carefully. Pursuing litigation would freeze trust assets during proceedings, meaning no support for your children during that period. Legal fees would deplete resources on both sides. Most importantly, the documented history of the trust's establishment and management makes your challenge highly unlikely to succeed. Timothy Grayson leaned toward James, speaking in a low voice that nevertheless carried in the quiet room. They have a point about the litigation risks. The documentation is solid, and courts generally respect clear testamentary intent. James sat silently for several moments, conflict evident in his expression. I recognized the struggle: pride versus practicality, disappointment versus realistic assessment of options. There's another factor to consider, Vanessa Mitchell added, her tone matter of fact but not unkind. Educational support represents an investment in your children's future capacity, rather than addressing immediate lifestyle preferences. It's the difference between providing a temporary solution and creating lasting opportunity. Her framing seemed to resonate with James in a way our previous arguments hadn't, highlighting the long-term benefits for his children rather than the limitations on his immediate access to funds. "What about Emma's learning assessments?" he asked, focusing suddenly on specific needs rather than general objections. "The agreement mentions support for educational interventions, but the comprehensive evaluation alone costs $8,000, and our insurance covers barely half." This concrete concern, centered on his daughter's welfare rather than abstract notions of fairness, offered a productive opening. "I'd be happy to cover the full assessment immediately," I responded. "In fact, I've researched several highly regarded educational psychologists who specialize in evaluating learning differences. That support doesn't need to wait for the formal agreement. We could arrange it next week." For the first time since entering the room, James's expression softened slightly. "She's been struggling," he admitted, parental concern momentarily, displacing financial frustration. "Her teacher says she's falling further behind despite being bright. The waiting list for assessment through the school district is 18 months long." This vulnerability, this genuine concern for his daughter's development, created a bridge across the financial chasm that had separated us. "I want to help, James. Not because of obligation, but because I love Emma and want her to thrive. The same goes for all your children." The conversation shifted then, becoming less about abstract financial principles and more about specific ways the agreement could address concrete needs while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Timothy Grayson suggested several minor modifications to the language regarding educational expenses, while Mrs. Reynolds proposed quarterly reviews of the children's needs rather than the annual assessment originally outlined. Throughout this more productive discussion, I noticed Uncle Robert watching James carefully, his expression suggesting he recognized something in my brother's gradual shift from defensiveness to pragmatic engagement. After nearly 2 hours of detailed negotiation, we reached a tentative agreement. The financial parameters remained essentially unchanged, focused on educational support rather than housing or general lifestyle funding, but with increased flexibility regarding timing and specific qualifying expenses. "I'll revise the document to reflect today's discussion and circulate it for review by Friday," Uncle Robert stated as the meeting concluded. "Assuming no further substantive concerns, we could finalize the agreement next week." As the others gathered their materials, James hesitated, then asked if we could speak privately. Mrs. Reynolds offered her office, leaving us alone in the suddenly quiet space. "I need to know something, Charlie," James said once the door closed behind the others. "Is this really what Grandma wanted? For you to have everything while my kids struggle?" The question cut to the heart of his resentment, not just the current financial disparity, but the perceived pattern of preference that had characterized our childhood. "Grandma established this trust when I was 6 years old, James," I replied carefully. "You were 13, already showing independence and maturity beyond your years. She saw you as self-sufficient in ways I couldn't be at that age, especially after the divorce. The trust wasn't about loving you less, it was about recognizing different needs at different stages." "But she never updated it," he pressed. "Even after I had children of my own, she maintained this extreme imbalance." I considered his perspective, acknowledging the genuine hurt beneath the financial claims. Grandma believed in individual responsibility and specific legacy rather than general distribution. Her letters make clear that she trusted me to make thoughtful decisions about supporting family connections without creating dependencies. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "The educational support in this agreement honors her values, while acknowledging my genuine commitment to your children's welfare. It's not everything you wanted, but it represents meaningful, sustainable help focused on their future opportunities. James was silent for several moments, internal conflict evident in his expression. Dad thinks I should hold out for more, he admitted finally. He says Grandma owed you nothing special, and that her resources should have been distributed equally among all her descendants. This confirmed Uncle Robert's assessment of my father's role in the situation. Dad and Grandma had a complicated relationship, I observed diplomatically. His perspective on her choices is filtered through decades of unresolved conflicts that have nothing to do with you or me or your children. James nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. He's been pushing hard for this challenge from the beginning, offering to connect me with attorneys, suggesting strategies. I thought it was about helping my family, but maybe it's about his own unresolved issues with Grandma's disapproval of his choices, I suggested gently. Either way, your children's needs are better served by this structured agreement than by years of costly litigation with uncertain outcomes. The silence that followed felt significant, a moment of potential reconnection after months of strained relations. Finally, James sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture reminiscent of our childhood. I want what's best for my kids, he said simply. Emma needs that assessment desperately. Ethan's teacher says he could be in accelerated math programs with the right resources. Noah loves the private preschool program, but we can barely afford 3 days a week. He met my gaze directly. If this agreement genuinely secures those opportunities, I can accept its limitations. Relief washed through me at this first step toward resolution. It does, I assured him. And beyond the formal agreement, I'm still your sister, still their aunt. This structure creates clear expectations and boundaries, but it doesn't define the full extent of our family connection. As we rejoined the others in the reception area, the tension that had characterized our arrival had noticeably diminished. While significant work remained to finalize the agreement and rebuild trust, this meeting had established a foundation for moving forward with both clear boundaries and genuine respect for family bonds. Watching James leave with his attorney, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: lingering sadness at the strain in our relationship, cautious optimism about the path forward, and profound gratitude for the unexpected alliance that had helped navigate this challenging terrain. Uncle Robert, Mrs. Reynolds, and Vanessa Mitchell had each contributed essential perspective and expertise, demonstrating the value of seeking guidance when facing complex situations that blend financial considerations with deeply personal connections. You handled that admirably, Mrs. Reynolds commented as we returned to her office. Maintaining both compassion and appropriate boundaries is extraordinarily difficult in family financial disputes. I had excellent guidance, I acknowledged, and Grandma's foresight. Her letters prepared me for exactly this challenge. Eleanor was remarkably perceptive about family dynamics, Mrs. Reynolds agreed. But don't underestimate your own growth. 6 months ago, you might have capitulated to emotional pressure or withdrawn completely. Today, you navigated a complex negotiation with wisdom and grace. Her observation highlighted an unexpected benefit of my inheritance journey, not just financial security, but accelerated personal development through navigating complex situations that demanded both emotional intelligence and strategic thinking. My grandmother's gift had created not only material resources, but opportunities for growth that were shaping me into someone capable of managing both wealth and relationships with increasing wisdom. As I left Meridian Financial that afternoon, I realized that the true value of inheritance extends far beyond monetary figures to encompass the principles, wisdom, and character development that accompany the responsibility of stewardship, lessons that would serve me long after specific dollar amounts had been spent or invested. February brought unexpected warmth to the city, melting the remnants of January's stubborn snowfall and hinting at an early spring. The formal agreement between James and me had been signed the previous week, establishing clear parameters for my support of his children's educational needs, while explicitly acknowledging the trust as my separate property, not subject to further claims. Though our personal relationship remained tentative, the resolution of financial expectations had relieved the immediate tension, allowing space for gradual healing. True to my commitment, I had already arranged and paid for Emma's comprehensive educational assessment, scheduled for the following month with a respected specialist in learning differences. The college funds for all 4 children were now officially established, with documentation provided to James and Melissa outlining the contribution schedule and investment strategy. These concrete actions had done more to rebuild trust than any words could have achieved, demonstrating my genuine commitment to supporting my nieces and nephews, despite the boundaries I'd maintained regarding larger financial requests. My professional life continued to flourish, with the successful completion of a major client acquisition positioning me for the promotion my supervisor had hinted at during our year-beginning review. The financial security provided by my inheritance had subtly transformed my workplace approach. I contributed ideas more confidently, took calculated risks that previously would have seemed too dangerous, and negotiated more effectively without the underlying fear of unemployment that had once colored all my professional decisions. One Wednesday afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds called, her typically composed voice carrying an unusual edge of urgency. "Charlotte, something has come to my attention that requires immediate discussion. Could you come to my office tomorrow morning? Say, 9 o'clock? Of course. I agreed, curiosity piqued by her uncharacteristic intensity. Is everything all right with the trust? The trust itself is secure, she assured me. But there's a situation developing that you should be aware of before it potentially escalates. I'd rather discuss it in person than over the phone. This cryptic response did little to alleviate my concern, but I respected Mrs. Reynolds' judgment, enough to wait for our meeting rather than pressing for details. The following morning, I arrived at Meridian Financial precisely at 9, having rescheduled an internal department meeting to accommodate the unexpected appointment. Mrs. Reynolds greeted me with her usual professional warmth, though I detected tension in her normally relaxed demeanor as she ushered me into her office. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she began once we were seated. "I received some troubling information yesterday from a colleague at First Century Bank across town. It appears that someone has been making inquiries about your trust, specifically attempting to determine whether you have authorized powers that would allow others to access funds." "What kind of inquiries?" I asked, immediately alert. "Initially, someone called their trust department claiming to be you, asking about procedures for adding secondary beneficiaries with limited withdrawal rights. When pressed for verification details, they ended the call abruptly." Mrs. Reynolds's expression grew more somber. 2 days later, a man visited in person, presenting himself as your financial advisor and requesting information about the trust's structure and access protocols. Alarm coursed through me. Did they provide his name? He introduced himself as Robert Mitchell and presented business cards identifying him as a senior financial consultant with Cornerstone Advisors. She slid a business card across her desk. The bank representative found the interaction suspicious enough to make copies of his credentials and later verify the information. I examined the card, noting the professional design and official looking. Credentials, complete with certification numbers and a downtown office address. "Robert Mitchell doesn't exist," Mrs. Reynolds continued, "nor does Cornerstone Advisors, at least not in this city. The address listed is actually a virtual office space that rents mailboxes and provides call forwarding services. Someone created a fake identity to try to access information about my trust," I summarized, the implications sending a chill through me despite the office's comfortable temperature. "Do they know who it was?" Mrs. Reynolds hesitated briefly before responding. "The bank has security footage of the visitor." She opened a folder on her desk and removed a printed still image from a security camera. Charlotte, I believe you'll recognize him. The photograph, though slightly grainy, was unmistakable. My father's face stared back at me, his expression serious as he leaned across a desk, apparently deep in conversation with someone outside the camera's frame. "Dad?" I whispered, shock rendering me momentarily speechless. The betrayal cut deep, yet part of me wasn't entirely surprised. My father had always approached financial matters with a certain moral flexibility, justifying questionable actions with elaborate rationalizations about family obligation or deserved compensation. "I'm afraid so," Mrs. Reynolds confirmed gently. First Century contacted me as a professional courtesy, since they recognize the trust's name and structure as being similar to ones we manage. They've documented the incident, but haven't taken further action since no actual fraud occurred. He was merely making inquiries. But he was clearly preparing for something, I reasoned, my initial shock giving way to analytical assessment. Creating fake credentials, establishing a false business identity, probing for access points, these aren't casual actions. He's planning something. "That's my concern as well," Mrs. Reynolds agreed. "Fortunately, the trust has substantial protections against unauthorized access. Multiple verification protocols are required for any significant changes or withdrawals. However, this behavior indicates a concerning level of determination." I sat back in my chair, trying to process this development. What's his endgame? Even if he somehow gained information about the trust's structure, he couldn't actually access funds without my direct involvement and multiple forms of identification. "There are several possibilities," Mrs. Reynolds replied, her expression troubled. "He might be looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit, perhaps hoping to find a provision that would allow family members some form of access under specific circumstances. Alternatively, he could be gathering information to support a more aggressive challenge to the trust's validity, though that path seems unlikely to succeed given the documentation we've already reviewed. Or he could be planning something more direct," I suggested, a disturbing possibility forming in my mind. "If he learned enough about access protocols, could he potentially impersonate me with sufficient documentation?" Mrs. Reynolds's expression confirmed my suspicion. Identity theft within families is unfortunately not uncommon, especially in situations involving significant assets. Parents often have access to their children's social security numbers, birth information, and other identifying details that could be misused. The thought of my own father attempting to fraudulently access my inheritance through identity theft or forgery was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Whatever his rationalizations, helping James's family, addressing his wife's mother's medical needs, resolving his own financial difficulties, the methodical nature of his actions revealed a calculated intent that couldn't be dismissed as momentary. Weakness or misguided good intentions. "What should we do?" I asked, struggling to separate my emotional response from necessary practical considerations. "First, we should implement additional security measures," Mrs. Reynolds advised. "I've already flagged your account for enhanced verification protocols, requiring in-person identification with photo ID for any inquiries or transaction requests. We should also consider setting up alerts for any access attempts, successful or otherwise." She paused, then continued more hesitantly. "The more difficult question is whether to confront your father directly or involve law enforcement. While his actions to date may not constitute prosecutable fraud, they clearly indicate intent that could escalate to criminal behavior." The prospect of reporting my own father to authorities sent a wave of conflicting emotions through me. The lingering loyalty of a daughter battling against the justified anger of someone whose trust had been violated. Despite our complicated relationship, taking such a step felt momentous, a potential point of no return in our already strained family dynamic. "Before making that decision," Mrs. Reynolds suggested, reading my conflicted expression, "I think we should consult with Robert Winters. As both a family member and legal professional, He occupies a unique position to advise on this situation." The suggestion made immediate sense. Uncle Robert had already demonstrated his commitment to both legal integrity and family well-being through his handling of James's trust challenge. His perspective on this new development would be invaluable. A call to his office secured an appointment for later that afternoon. As Mrs. Reynolds and I waited in the reception area of the elegant downtown law firm where he had practiced for over 30 years, I struggled to organize my thoughts about this latest betrayal. The systematic nature of my father's actions, creating false credentials, establishing a fake business identity, making exploratory contacts with financial institutions, suggested a degree of premeditation that couldn't be dismissed as impulsive poor judgment. Uncle Robert received us in his spacious corner office, his normally composed expression growing increasingly grave as Mrs. Reynolds detailed the situation. When she produced the security photograph confirming my father's identity, he removed his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture so reminiscent of my grandmother that it momentarily took my breath away. "I wish I could say I'm surprised," he said finally. "But Robert has always had a complicated relationship with financial boundaries. Even as children, he viewed family resources as communal property to which he had automatic entitlement rather than as individual assets requiring respect and permission." "What do you think he's planning?" I asked, valuing his insight into my father's potential motivations and methods. "Most likely, he's exploring multiple angles simultaneously," Uncle Robert assessed, gathering information about access protocols, while also searching for technical vulnerabilities in the trust structure. Robert has always believed himself more clever than he actually is, particularly in financial matters. The characterization, though harsh, aligned with my own observations of my father's pattern of overestimating his financial acumen while underestimating associated risks, a combination that had contributed to his series of career setbacks and investment failures. "The immediate question," Uncle Robert continued, "is how to respond to this discovery. There are several options, each with different implications for both security and family relationships." He outlined the possibilities with the methodical clarity I'd come to expect. We could implement enhanced security measures without direct confrontation, privately confront my father with the evidence while issuing a clear warning about legal consequences, or involve law enforcement immediately, given the apparent intent to commit fraud. "Before deciding," he cautioned, "consider the potential involvement of others." "Has James expressed any knowledge of these activities? Could he be coordinating with your father as part of a more comprehensive strategy to access the trust?" The question startled me. Despite our recent conflicts over the inheritance, I hadn't considered James potentially participating in such deliberate deception. "The agreement we just signed explicitly acknowledges the trust as my separate property," I pointed out. "Why would he participate in undermining that after reaching resolution?" "Agreements sometimes serve as strategic delays rather than genuine acceptance," Uncle Robert observed. "It's possible James is pursuing the formal educational support while simultaneously exploring less conventional access methods through your father." The possibility was painful to contemplate, but couldn't be dismissed without consideration. James's financial pressures remained substantial despite the educational support established through our agreement, and my father had demonstrated considerable influence over him throughout the trust dispute. "I don't want to believe James would participate in something like this," I said finally. "It crosses a line from disagreement about fairness into deliberate deception and potential fraud." "I tend to agree," Mrs. Reynolds interjected. "During our negotiation sessions, James demonstrated frustration and disappointment, but not dishonesty. He accepted the agreement's terms with reluctance, but apparent sincerity." Uncle Robert nodded, accepting this assessment. "In that case, I recommend a two-pronged approach. Immediately implement enhanced security measures to protect the trust, regardless of who might attempt unauthorized access, while simultaneously confronting your father privately with the evidence we've gathered." Confronting him directly seems risky, I observed. Wouldn't that just alert him that we're aware of his activities and potentially drive him to more sophisticated methods? Not if the confrontation is properly structured, Uncle Robert replied, a hint of the formidable attorney emerging in his demeanor. I propose a meeting in my office, professional, documented, and with clear articulation of both the evidence we possess and the serious legal consequences should his actions progress further. He continued, outlining a strategic approach that balanced firmness with an opportunity for resolution. This isn't just about protecting financial assets, Charlotte. It's about establishing fundamental boundaries regarding acceptable behavior within family relationships, boundaries your father has repeatedly tested throughout his adult life. As I considered his recommendation, I recognized that this situation represented more than a pragmatic security concern. It symbolized a pivotal moment in reclaiming personal agency within my family system, asserting not just financial boundaries, but fundamental expectations regarding respect and integrity. Let's do it, I decided, my voice steadier than I expected. Schedule the meeting at your office, present the evidence directly, and make the potential consequences unambiguously clear. Uncle Robert nodded approvingly. I'll arrange it for early next week. In the meantime, Mrs. Reynolds will implement the enhanced security protocols we've discussed. As we concluded the meeting and prepared to leave, Uncle Robert asked to speak with me privately for a moment. Once Mrs. Reynolds had stepped into the hallway, he fixed me with a penetrating gaze reminiscent of my grandmother at her most insightful. Charlotte, this situation, difficult as it is, represents an important opportunity, not just to protect your financial resources, but to establish the terms on which you'll engage with family moving forward. Your grandmother believed deeply in your capacity for both compassion and appropriate boundary setting. That faith wasn't misplaced. His words carried the weight of both family history and forward-looking purpose, affirming my grandmother's vision while acknowledging the challenging path of bringing that vision to fruition in the complex reality of family dynamics. As I left his office and rejoined Mrs. Reynolds, I felt a surprising sense of clarity amid the emotional turmoil of the day's revelations. The path ahead would be difficult, requiring confrontation I would have preferred to avoid, but the stakes extended beyond monetary concerns to the fundamental question of how I would allow myself to be treated by those who claimed the privileges of family connection. The inheritance that had initially seemed like a simple financial blessing had become a catalyst for essential growth, challenging me to develop not just financial literacy, but emotional resilience, strategic thinking, and the courage to defend. Boundaries essential to genuine well-being and healthy relationships. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.